Welcome to the Mac's Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit chat.
Okay, welcome to the Apple Podcast. This is Lex at Mac's Future, and this is episode 106. And today is Saturday, February 18th. And this is a chit-chat-free podcast. You can help it out by giving it a positive review in the iTunes store. There's a lot of Apple news this week. There's all sorts of interesting stuff coming out. And, so we're going to cover everything. Big news from Apple. Again, it's chit-chat-free. This is Lex at Mac's Future. Thanks for listening. Okay, so Apple dropped a bombshell yesterday. Out of the blue, no one really expected it. Apple announced and released a beta update to the operating system for the Macintosh called Mountain Lion. Now, the current OS X operating system for the Macintosh is Lion, which officially came out, I think, in the fall. And, the beta came out of Lion last spring, and there was no inkling. There was no rumors. There was Zippo. This was one of the best kept secrets that Apple has ever had. Apple just suddenly announced a sneak peek of OS X Mountain Lion. Mountain Lion's the new name, and they say that sometime this summer, Mountain Lion will be released to the Apple masses. Now, they dropped the name Mac, so it's not Mac OS X, it's now just OS X Mountain Lion. And they released to anybody who has a developer's beta of Mountain. Anybody who has a developer's account can get the beta of Mountain Lion and install it on a Mac. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of how cool this update is. So, let's go into it. Okay, so the big new features for the Mountain Lion update are that it makes it more like the iOS on iPad and iPhone. And so what are those things? Let's see. A lot of the things that are cool in the iPhone and iPad have now come to the Mac. So, for example, they broke out. Well, there's a great app on the iPhone and iPad called Reminders, and it's standalone from the calendar. And Reminders now is separate. So basically, the apps, the way they were on the iPad or the way they are on the iPad and the iPhone are coming to the Mac. So, Reminders is a standalone app on the iPad and the iPhone separate from the calendar, which is really great. It's very minimal. And so that's now on the Mac. And I think that totally makes sense, because what Apple's now doing is saying we're not going to make the Mac be exactly like the interface of the iPhone or iPad, but make it more similar. And it does make sense to have apps that are good on the iPhone and iPad that are made by Apple also be available in some form on the Mac. So, for example, for a long time, Apple has had the iChat app on the Mac, but the iChat app could not communicate with the iMessages app, or the Messages app, which is great. Messages allows you to send iMessages or text messages from any iOS 5 device like an iPhone or iPad to each other, and circumvent the regular text messaging from a message plan, text message plan from AT&T. So you can send free text messages. Well, what they did, now we have the Messages app on the Mac through Mountain Lion. Now what they did is they didn't get rid of iChat. Rather, they kept the iChat functions and added in the messages functions, and then they called it Messages. So other things they brought over are the Notes app. It's now not part of Mail. It's a separate app, just like on the iPhone and iPad. And also they brought the Notification Center, where you get all your notifications unified, and other things they brought over from the functionality of the iPhone and iPad are the easy integration of sharing, particularly Twitter. So Twitter is now built in to it. So you can tweet from pretty much any place now in Mountain Lion. And the share sheets are, like you have that standard arrow, like on a lot of the interface, like with Safari on the iPhone and iPad. Well, now that function is sort of built in to a lot of parts of Mountain Lion. And then, of course, Game Center. I don't really use it, but a lot of games on the iPhone and iPad are integrated with Game Center, which is like a social networking place where you can, find your friends and have your game play it. So then games that are sold through the Mac App Store will be integrated with Game Center. And then this is really cool. Certain of the newer Macintoshes will have AirPlay and AirPlay mirroring. That means you're going to be able to mirror whatever's on your Mac through an Apple TV to a big TV. So now the whole mirroring function comes to the Mac, as well as AirPlay. So video or audio, you're going to be able to just send over to an Apple TV. Now, you already could do it before, but this is more seamless, and the branding is similar. And then the other really interesting thing is Gatekeeper. Now, this is not something on the iPhone or iPad, but Gatekeeper is very interesting. Gatekeeper, remember the whole controversy with the Mac App Store? In other words, what about apps that can't really go through the Mac App Store because they can't really qualify, for all the criteria that Apple has in terms of not getting into the operating system? So Gatekeeper is a compromise, because what Gatekeeper is in the preference settings, you're going to basically be able to say that you have three choices. You could say, I only want apps on my Mac, and if you're looking at the screenshot here, I have a close-up on Apple's page. You could say, I only want apps that are sold through the Mac App Store to be on this computer. Or you could say, I only want Mac App Store apps and identified developers. Or you could say from anywhere. Now, anywhere is the current state, which is you can get it from your Mac App Store or download from a website. Now, but here's what's interesting. Apple made a little compromise and is allowing developers to get an authentic developer signature. And if you check just from the Mac App Store and identified developer, that means you are going to be able to download apps outside of the Mac App Store. And if that developer has a registered developer signature with Apple, Apple will check that app and make sure that it has no malware, and that it's okay. And that way, only sort of trusted Apple apps that are not from the Mac App Store, as well as apps through the Mac App Store, could be on the Mac. Now, this is, I think, a lot of developers like the, let's say, the super duper backup software that cannot be sold in the Mac App Store. I think they're thrilled that Apple's doing this, because Apple's basically saying that it's allowing branding for developers, but they don't have to sell through the Mac App Store. And if they don't have to sell through the Mac App Store, then Apple doesn't take a 30% cut. What Apple says for Gatekeeper is control what you install. Install apps only from the Mac App Store, from identified developers, or from anywhere you want. So Apple's giving you more choices in the future, basically. It's saying there's a middle ground, which is, yeah, you can download anywhere from anywhere on the internet, but how about you don't download from the Mac App Store but want an app from the internet, but you want to make sure it's trusted. And the key is that Apple's going to have like these, trusted, certified signature. So I think this is very cool. Now, Apple has a whole little thing about the security here on what is malware, and it says malware is malicious software that can come from anywhere on the web. Anyone can unknowingly download and install malware because it's deviously disguised as something else. Once you're tricked into downloading it, malware can damage your computer and even gather sensitive information about you. While malware is one of the biggest security challenges on personal computers, it's hardly an issue on a Mac, and Apple is working to see that it won't be. And then it talks about the developer ID program. It says Apple wants to help you steer clear of malware even when you download applications from places other than the Mac App Store. That's why Apple created the Developer ID. As part of the Mac Developer Program, Apple gives developers a unique developer ID for signing their apps. A developer's digital signature allows Gatekeeper to verify that their app is not known malware and that it hasn't been tampered with. If an app doesn't have a developer ID associated with it, Gatekeeper can let you know before you install it. It's another step Apple takes to keep your Mac safe. And this is what it says about the digital signature. A digital signature makes it possible to verify that an application comes from a developer with a developer ID and that the application hasn't been tampered with. Digital signatures are created by combining a secret key known only to the developer with a digital summary of the contents of the application. It's all wrapped together in an encrypted file that becomes part of the app. Gatekeeper checks the encrypted file to make sure everything is okay. So I think this is a great development, and I think a lot of developers are going to be thrilled with this because it's no longer that you have to go with the Mac App Store. There is this middle ground where you can be in the Apple family without selling it in the Mac App Store. I wonder if they will ever go this route with iOS apps. I mean, I haven't heard a lot of people talking about this, but isn't it possible that if this is a success, Apple will go this route for the apps that are not sold through the App Store? For example, there's a whole bunch of jailbreak apps, like from Cydia, from the Cydia jailbreak store. What if Apple said, hey, we're going to allow apps to be installed on the iPhone or iPad, not through the App Store, but if they have a digital signature, we'll let it come on. I think that would be a big hit. So who knows, maybe Apple will go that route too. Now, one of the other big features of Mountain Lion is that the Mac through Mountain Lion will be much more integrated into iCloud. And so through Mountain Lion, you will have more of your apps syncing through iCloud with your other devices like the iPhone and the iPad. And it basically, they have a little diagram that shows, you just sign in once. It says with your Apple ID to set up iCloud and Mail, Contacts, Calendar, Safari, the Mac App Store, and FaceTime, and everything just syncs. And they say documents in the cloud. Now I guess they're gonna update Pages and the other iWork documents like Keynote and Numbers. And basically, you're gonna update something, let's say in Pages on your Mac, and it'll be automatically updated on your iPhone, iPad, or iPod Touch. It says here, keep your documents in the cloud and open them on your Mac, iPad, iPhone, or iPod Touch. When you edit a document, the changes appear across all your devices. So, that's going to be a cool feature. And what else? So look, basically they're giving you 10 big features, or they're announcing in Mountain Lion. Now, what's interesting is that they made it immediately available this Thursday for those who are in the Apple Mac Developers Program. And I was able to download the beta. And so you can install it. It's still in beta. It's not going to be released till the summer. And so this is, something people are playing around with, and I did install it. And I found it to be pretty stable. I mean, I already had Lion, and it was pretty easy to do. You download it through the Mac App Store. If you go to the developers page, and I think it's like $99 a year, and you just click on your coupon, it takes you to the Mac App Store and you download it. Now, it took me all night to download like the 3 or 4 gigabyte Mountain Lion beta, and that's, I think, because everybody was downloading it and Apple's servers were taxed. But it was, it is pretty cool. Let me see. I can show you the the install. Do I have it here? The Mac. Oh, I think I installed it through another hard drive or something like that. Let's see. No, I can't see it here in Launchpad. So look, what if you're interested? Join the developers program, pay $99 and download Mountain Lion beta. Now, I wouldn't put it on your main computer. I put it on my MacBook Air. My main computer is my iMac. Or put it on a second drive and like external drive and boot your Mac from there, because it still is beta. You never know what's not going to work or what's broken. But I find it pretty cool. Now, let's see if this works. Well, I have nothing in the notification center. What's cool about the notification center, it's off to the right near your little Finder search, your little search area up there in the right corner. Right now I have nothing in the notification center. So look, I mean, to me, these are cool features. I think they really add a lot, and I'm looking forward when the full version comes out this summer. Now, one of the sharing things that's in Mountain Lion that I kind of like is you have more choices in sharing, and what's cool is, so here's that like arrow thing, the sharing thing, but in certain programs, let's take what is it? One of the photo apps. If you press the button, you've got more choices now. Like they have email, messages, Twitter, AirDrop, Flickr, add to photos, set buddy picture. So I think they had like send to Flickr before, but one of the new things is AirDrop. Now AirDrop is that cool feature that was in Lion, where in the Finder, let me see if I can show you. If you look in the Finder here, if on the left bar under all my files, you have something called AirDrop, and it's looking basically for another Mac that has Lion on it, and then you can drag files in here and transfer them through Wi-Fi if you're on a common Wi-Fi network. But what's cool about this new feature is you no longer have to go to the Finder. You can just send it to AirDrop. But let's say you're in this photo app, and you can just select it, so you don't have to go to the Finder, and it'll send it to AirDrop. I have another screenshot here where you can do it through the Finder too. Like you could select a file, then right-click, and then you have a choice under Share. There's like a new Share button when you right-click, and it says Send to Email, Send to Message, Send to AirDrop, and then Send to Vimeo. Now here's what's interesting. Why did Apple set Vimeo? And this is a video file. This is one of my podcast videos, and so it's allowing me to share it, but the built-in right-click share for video is Vimeo, another video hosting service that competes with YouTube. And they don't have a choice for Apple's YouTube. Now, where do you set this choice? Well, if you go to your system preferences, under iCloud, you can choose, is it under iCloud? No, it's under sharing. Hold on. It's under, maybe it's not in the preferences. But anyways, it seems like you have a choice of sending it to, no, it's got to be under I thought there was a sharing to Vimeo. But the weird thing is, why don't they give you a choice to YouTube? Oh, here we go, sharing. If you go to sharing and Well, I don't know. I got to find it. So that's, I think, a cool feature. And, you know, so there's other little goodies that are in Mountain Lion. Now, another great feature in Mountain Lion is that for Safari, they finally have a unified search bar and URL address. So if you remember on Lion and all predecessor operating systems for the Mac, Safari has two little windows at the top. One is the search area, and then the other the address area. Well, just like Chrome, Google's Chrome browser, now there's just one area. So you can type the address or you can do a search. So, that's definitely an improvement. So, there's lots of little tweaks that make it better. Okay, so one of the really different things about the announcement of Mountain Lion on Thursday by Apple is how they did it. There were so many things that are unusual about it. First of all, one of the most unusual things is how quickly they announced it after the Lion update. Usually, Mac operating systems are not updated so quickly. They're usually upgraded like in 18 months or 2 years or something like that. And it was only like recently that they started selling Lion, and already they've now announced that Mountain Lion is coming out and will be coming out this summer. So that's pretty amazing. And Apple announced that the Mac is going to be upgraded every year. So they're going to be on a yearly upgrade basis. So what does this say? This says that Apple is very committed to the Mac platform, that it's not dying out, and that Apple's going to really care in making the operating system, up to par and upgraded just like the iOS operating system. Now, some people are interpreting that these iOS-like apps coming to the Mac means that eventually the Mac operating system will become the iOS from the iPad and the iPhone. And I don't think Apple's actually doing that for now. I think what Apple is doing is trying to have a consistent and common design and also make them more compatible with each other. Because what iCloud does is make all your devices compatible with each other. And by having common apps like iMessages, like I know a lot of people wanted iMessage or the Messages app on the Mac, because how cool would it be? I'm like iMessaging now with my wife all the time. She has an iPhone, I have an iPhone, we have an iPad. And I love the fact that I don't have to pay for texts through AT&T or any cell phone provider to text her. I can just iMessage her. And it's huge. Now, and how cool would it be if those iMessages could pop up on a Mac? And obviously Apple saw that coming, and so that's what they're doing. They're putting it on the Mac and integrating it with iChat. So that's a big development. But here's the other big thing. It's how Apple announced Mountain Lion. They didn't hold a press conference. What they did was really interesting, and it's recounted by Daring Fireball's John Gruber, because he was one of the select few who got the invite. And what Apple did is Apple reached out to select journalists, whether they're famous journalists, journalists from famous newspapers like the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, or famous Mac journalists like John Gruber, who blogs about the Mac and Apple and other technology for Daring Fireball, his own website. So John Gruber, according to a post called Mountain Lion, Thursday, 16 February 2012, he recounts how a week before February 16th, he was summoned by Apple to a hotel suite in Manhattan. And he didn't know what it was going to be. He agreed to embargo whatever information he got for a week till Thursday morning, February 16th, and then he could write about it. And what they did was he was set up by Apple PR with a meeting with Phil Schiller, who's a high-up executive at Apple. And Phil Schiller, and I guess some other people from Apple, came to New York City at the suite and met with John Gruber individually and met with other journalists individually and showed off the Mountain Lion software and talked about how important it was, and gave them a working copy of Mountain Lion Beta on a MacBook Air. So he says on his blog, that Phil Schiller said to him, quote, "We're starting to do some things differently," end quote. And he says, "We were sitting in a comfortable hotel suite in Manhattan just over a week ago. I'd been summoned a few days earlier by Apple PR with the offer of a private product briefing. I had no idea heading into the meeting what it was about. I had no idea how it would be conducted. This was new territory for me, I think, and I think for Apple." So it's really interesting. They sort of took him through it. All they talked about was Mountain Lion. So why do you think Apple did it like this? And one of the takeaways that Gruber and other journalists said was that Apple was emphasizing how important Mountain Lion is. But on the other hand, if the operating system for the Mac is so important, why didn't they have a big press event? Why didn't they, herald it as some big thing? I think in a sense it's because Mountain Lion is an incremental improvement over Lion. And so they didn't think it was so monumental a change to, warrant a big press conference. On the other hand, I think they knew that they could get the press interested if they targeted certain influential journalists and gave them a week in advance preview of it. And that way they could keep the secret of, Mountain Lion being launched, but also make sure that it got a lot of coverage when they revealed it. And all they did was basically lift the embargo on Thursday and then just put this website on Apple's website that heralded Mountain Lion and then made it available for the developers. So I think this was a clever strategy. Now, what's interesting is some people said that Apple was mad at the New York Times for running those stories about China and the sweatshops at Foxconn, and that the New York Times was not invited and didn't get a sneak preview. And some people wrote articles saying that the New York Times, David Pogue, didn't have screenshots of Mountain Lion and that he wasn't invited to this a week ahead, thing. Now, what I think though that people who took potshots at Apple for saying that Apple didn't invite the New York Times out of retribution for the China stories, I think they're wrong, because I was listening to John Gruber's podcast, the talk show on 5by5, and he mentioned that when he showed up for his private meeting a week before regarding Mountain Lion with Phil Schiller in a hotel room in New York, when he was leaving, David Pogue of the New York Times was arriving for the same meeting. So it's clear the New York Times, at least Gruber's recounting of his meeting, shows that David Pogue was there. So I think people are wrong in terms of the New York Times. Apple did not blackball the New York Times for the China stories, because it looks like David Pogue was there. Now, David Pogue didn't have a lot of pictures on his column, but that could have been an editorial decision by the New York Times. Now, obviously, Apple did not give a preview to Gizmodo, because Gizmodo, is maybe not the kind of blog that it wants to give the preview to, and given Gizmodo's involvement with the lost or stolen Apple iPhone 4. Anyways, I think it's interesting that they took this route. Maybe for some things it's a more effective route than having a big preview where people have to fly to San Francisco. This is something that maybe is more effective strategically. And who knows, maybe one day I'll get an invite from Apple in some secret hotel room. That would be kind of an honor to get a little peek. Okay, so one of the other big things that happened this week was that on Tuesday, Tim Cook, the new CEO of Apple, who followed after Steve Jobs, well, he spoke at a conference sponsored by Goldman Sachs, and his speech was streamed on the internet, and he basically answered questions posed to him by Goldman analyst Bill Shop. And what was interesting was that he was very poised, and I think investors were very pleased with Tim Cook's performance. And in fact, the New York Times Bits column ran an article, Apple Chief Unveils a New Product Himself. Now, Tim Jobs' performance, I think I would give it an A, because he just was, very bright, gave great answers, was very careful what he said, but gave good answers and sort of let loose and was a little more relaxed than when he was number 2 at Apple behind Steve Jobs. Among other things, people asked, how things have changed since Steve Jobs passed away. And he went out of his way to say, look, the thinking and the way that Steve did things was drilled into the people at Apple. And so that sort of dedication to making great products and not having a huge product line and being really focused on cranking out great products are still there. Now, in terms of how big the market for iPad, he thinks the iPad could be huge. He points out that he thinks that at some point it'll be bigger than the PC market. Now, the PC market, I think last year, there were 360 million computers sold. And altogether, Apple sold 55 million, I think, iPads. So getting to 360 million iPads would be enormous. He also talked about China and just what a tremendous opportunity there is for China. And he also talked about how really the smartphone market is going to grow. It's maybe at a 1.5 billion smartphones now, and it's going to grow to 2 billion or 2.5 billion. And then he points out that Apple has 25% of the smartphone market, so it has a lot of room to grow, if it continues to make successful iPhones and smartphones. So I think investors were really happy. He also talked about Apple's massive cash hoard and whether there'll be a dividend. And he didn't say there's going to be a dividend paid. In other words, a distribution of the monies to investors. But he made it clear that the board of directors is actively considering all options as to what to do with all the money that it has saved up. Apple has, I think, $100 billion of cash and short-term securities saved up. So he was, I think a lot of investors are sort of hopeful that maybe he'll do a dividend. So, overall, his performance was really good, and that's why I think what the New York Times was saying is that the new product that Apple revealed when he spoke was himself, that he's the new product. Now, Apple's stock price appears to have reacted well by Tim Cook's speech. Now, he spoke on, I guess, Tuesday the 14th. The next day, Wednesday the 15th, it went all the way up. It had been trading at a little above $500 on Tuesday the 14th. And then on the 15th, there was huge trading volume, and it went way up to 520, what was it, 529, I think, or 526. And then in the afternoon, it sort of tanked and got all the way down back below 500 to 498 and got as low as, 490 the next day, Thursday, before recovering by the end of the week to trade a little above 500. So, this was the week where Apple stock broke $500 a share. Someone pointed out that Apple stock, I think it was Mike Egeland, who's on Google+, he pointed out that Apple stock, one share, is now more valuable than the entry-level iPad, which sells for $499. So, Apple's doing well. Disclosure, I have shares of Apple stock. It's a risky investment. Any investment's a risky investment. You don't know which way it's going to go. It's going to go up or down. And Apple now, it's really an incredibly valuable company. Its total market cap is $468 billion. So, it's been a good week for Apple. It's hit new highs. Tim Cook is giving a great speech. And Apple reveals a new operating system for the Macintosh. Now, one of the nice things that Apple did on Thursday, for the people who don't want to download the developer's preview of Mountain Lion, is release a beta of Apple's Messages app that will work on Lion. And it's only going to work on Lion until Mountain Lion comes out, and then the beta won't work anymore. But what's interesting is the MacRumors site looked into some of the artwork that is sort of bundled under the resources of the Messages beta app, and they found that there are high definition artwork. And it says here, Apple's Messages beta for Mac includes Retina-sized artwork. And it basically says, as on the iPhone, Apple's plan was to make it easier on developers to jump to exactly 2 times the linear solution. So it basically says that a look at the resources from Apple's new Messages app shows several graphics that come in multi-part TIFFs that include regular and double resolution versions. In fact, it says if you look at the information embedded with the images, you can see the resources were at one point named the same at ×2 convention. So MacRumors believes that Apple is in Mountain Lion at some point is going to coincide with Macs that have Retina displays, and that could mean MacBook Pros that have 2880 × 1800 pixel displays, like really high-end pixels. And I think we talked about this last week. That makes sense because if Apple's going to release an iPad that has really high pixel concentrations, much higher than any MacBook Pro, then it's going to have to make a MacBook Pro that can have that kind of resolution. So developers can work on a MacBook Pro and make apps for the iPad while seeing exactly that high definition pixel. So I think in the coming year, between the iPad and upgrades to the MacBook Pros and the other Macs, we're going to see much higher resolution screens from Apple. And so this, kudos to the MacRumors.com website. Arnold Kim is the founder and runs that blog and Mac blog, and it's a great resource for any people who follow Apple and Mac. Now, another site, CNET, points out that we might be getting a new Apple TV very soon. CNET had an article entitled Apple TV Taken Off Store Shelves, Refresh Coming Soon. And some people think that they're going to come out with the true high definition output on the Apple TV 1080p. Right now you can see 720p. And basically CNET reports that Best Buy and Walmart don't even list the Apple TV on their sites, and Amazon has stopped selling it. So this is probably a sign that Apple is going to do a refresh to the Apple TV. Obviously the Apple TV is still going to be important because AirPlay is such a big part of not only the iPhone and the iPad, but also the Mac now, with AirPlay mirroring on the Mac. So, it could be Apple's having this big event for the iPad on March 7th, and maybe they will also announce the Apple TV, because the Apple TV is sort of linked now in the ecosystem to the iPhone, the iPad, and the Mac. So if there's a new iPad discussed, they may be coming out with a new Apple TV. So that'll be very cool. Now, Cult of Mac had a very interesting article on February 17th regarding the significance of AirPlay mirroring on Mountain Lion on the Mac. And the article is entitled, Why Mountain Lion's AirPlay Mirroring is Hollywood's Worst Nightmare. And it's kind of an interesting article because it's basically saying that Apple is sort of screwing over the big content makers like CBS or other sites that offer video content, because you're going to be able to sort of just mirror what's on your Mac to a big TV, thereby putting it on your big TV. And remember, the big content providers, when sort of restricted Hulu and Boxy from showing certain content through a device to a big TV, because they want to sell stuff on TVs and make money. And remember, Google, when the Google TV box came out, which allowed you to browse and then show stuff on TV, a lot of content providers had their site block the Google TV. Now, the question is, so this is a threat to the big content makers by Apple, because anybody armed with, let's say, a MacBook Air sitting around in their living room can just throw the TV to the big TV from the MacBook Air, but they can also do it from the iPhone, and they can also do it through the iPad. And one thing that the content providers could do, the article points out, is block Macs that are out running Mountain Lion from accessing the content or sensing when they're using AirPlay mirroring. And Apple could help them block it by having AirPlay mirror not work on certain sites, or help the sites figure out where AirPlay mirroring is. But Cult of Mac points out, hey, this might drive the content makers to start adding their content to the iTunes store, because they've been holding out from having their content on the Apple TV or on the iTunes store. But maybe this is an incentive, because Apple's basically saying, look, if you don't join us by giving us your content, we're going to make it really easy through the iPad, the iPhone, and the MacBook Air or whatever to send content to the Apple TV. So I think this was a very smart article by Ryan Foss at Cult of Mac, and I'm curious to see how the content providers deal with what Apple has done. So good article, Ryan Foss. Okay, one of the stupidest articles that I sort of read, I think it's stupid, was in the Washington Post, and it was entitled, "Why is Apple stock so cheap?" And basically, the article points out that Apple stock, even at trading at $500 per share, has a low PE ratio, price to earnings, of $14, 14 times, which is low. And there's a lot of theories as to why Apple is still a cheap stock in terms of PE ratio, which is profits to earnings. And then this guy, Jonathan Wheel, he thinks that it's low because investors believe that Apple's PE ratio is only low because of an accounting change. And he focuses on back in, I guess it was when 2009 or so, Apple switched its accounting. Now, what does this mean? Under older accounting rules, if Apple sold something, certain things that required software upgrades in the future, Apple could not book the sale all in one quarter, but would have to string it out over several quarters. But there was an accounting change that basically said you could recognize all or most of the revenue up front in the quarter that you sold it. So what does that mean? Come on, if before, if there were upgrades of software to a Mac, or to an iPhone, you'd have to spread out the revenue when you sold it, let's say in 2009. But come on, these products are really not like that. That was kind of silly to spread it out. The rule change made sense. And it's silly because the rule, the current way Apple is recognizing revenue is more realistic to their products, because these software upgrades are de minimis. People are really paying for the hardware, and you do get great software. Like, for example, the iPhone, your software upgrades are free. Apple doesn't make you pay when you go from iOS 4 to iOS 5. And under the old accounting rules, since they're not charging you, you would have to defer the cost of the revenue that you got when you sold the iPhone, because the iPhone would get free upgrades later. Well, that's kind of silly, because Apple's revenue is really when they sell it. They're getting the money right then. So it's kind of silly to defer it. Yes, there's some cost to developing the operating system, and you have some responsibility to continue giving it free in the future, but you shouldn't have to recognize it over time. And so I think this is silly. I don't think that investors think that Apple's PE ratio is low only because of the change in accounting. I mean, the bottom line is they're getting cold, hard cash coming in every quarter, and their cash reserves are close to $100 billion. So, I really don't agree with this article, and I think it's kind of stupid. So the next story is kind of disturbing, and I'm reading about the follow-up to it in ArsTechnica, an article entitled "Google Hit with FTC Complaint Says Circumventing Safari Privacy Features Accidental." So one of the things that sort of broke this week is that, Safari on the iPhone and the iPad has private browsing, so that you can't be tracked. And apparently someone discovered, I guess it was a Stanford graduate student named Jonathan Mayer, and there were then 2 articles in the Wall Street Journal. One headline was Google's iPhone tracking, and basically Google found a way to secretly track people using Safari browser on the iPhone and iPad without Apple's knowledge or without the user's knowledge. And according to this article, a consumer watchdog advocacy group asked the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to investigate whether Google violated a previous privacy agreement with the FTC by tracking cookies in a way that circumvents default privacy settings in Apple's Safari browser. And that ArsTechnica points out Google's method of getting around Safari's default blockage of third-party cookies was detailed by that Stanford student in Google. Now, Google says it was unintentional, and they stopped doing it as soon as this news broke, which is sort of like an admission by them that it was wrong. Google said that the code was used by Google as part of its program to place the +1 button in advertisements. And the journal explained, quote, Safari generally blocks cookies that come from elsewhere, such as advertising networks or other trackers, but there are exceptions to this rule, including if you interact with an advertisement or form in a certain way. It allows to set a cookie even if you aren't technically visiting the site. Google's code, which was placed on certain ads that use the company's double-click ad technology, took advantage of this loophole. So apparently other advertising companies were also accused of doing the same thing. Vibrant Media, Media Innovation Group, and Point Roll. And Google is claiming that this was Safari functionality problem and that the cookies spread by accident. So I think Google's in a bit of hot water here. And, I use Google, but here's the thing, Google's business is advertising. Their whole thing, almost all their revenue, almost all Google's revenue comes from advertising. And so Google's interest is in keeping track of what you're doing. Apple's interest, and I think Apple's interest is in really selling stuff that you buy, like hardware and maybe software. They're not really selling you ads. They have this iAd thing, in the iOS, but it's not really doing well. So Google's getting almost all of its revenue from advertising. And so when Apple makes like these browsers on the iPad or iPhone that can keep people from tracking you, that threatens Google's business. But Google, is that really the way to handle it? Now on Google Plus, there were, I sort of got into a debate with some people regarding whether this is good or bad. And, I basically said, look, companies like Google, they can track you, but they should fully disclose to you that they're, tracking you, and give you an opt-out so that you're not tracked. It should be up to you. They shouldn't secretly track you or not make it clear to you that you're being tracked. And somebody said, if you go to your Google whatever preferences, there's some disclosure there that they're going to track you. But come on, the average person, whether you're, there's a lot of like everyday people, like grandmothers and people, with very little education. Are they really going to go look buried into the terms of service that Google has with a Google account and tell you that, even when you leave a Google page and you go all sorts of places that they're tracking you? There should be very clear disclosure. I mean, Google should have a big, pop-up ad come out that says, we're tracking you. If you don't want to be tracked, press the button. Now, Google's not going to do that because Google wants to track you. So imagine if you go to a site and Google has a big pop-up come out, like a big browser thing. Hi, we're Google. We just want to let you know we're tracking you. We know where you're going, what sites you're going to. How do you feel about that? If you don't like it, click this button. On the other hand, if we track you, we might be able to show better ads to you. But that's the way Google should do it. We shouldn't have these sort of secret tracking going on. So, shame on you, Google. Okay, so speaking of privacy screw-ups, Apple sort of had its own little privacy screw-up, and it wasn't really directly its fault. What happened was that Apple, one of the apps on the iPhone, a third-party app, uploaded your address book to their servers without making it clear or telling you that it did so. And somebody discovered this, and it caused a big uproar. But it turns out there was sort of a loophole, and Apple does, you're not supposed to do that. And so, there's a big huff about this, and a lot of people, criticized that app, and the people behind it, other people defended them, saying, of course, they're taking your address book. But really, there should be some notice to you that your address book is being accessed and taken up to the server. The app is Path. That's the sort of photo and other stuff sharing with a limited number of friends app on the iPhone, and I think it's on the iPad too. And Path was taking your address book and sending it up to its servers and then using it without sort of telling you. So this resulted in a U.S. congressman sending a letter to Apple requesting information on privacy practices, specifically as they relate to address book data being collected and stored by the app developers. MacRumors here has an article, Apple to require explicit permission for iOS apps accessing address book data. And so then Apple basically is going to come out with an update, and it says here, Apple has been testing iOS 5.1 for some time, but appears to have slowed development as the company is assumed to be waiting to release it to the public alongside iPad 3. And it says Apple issued a statement to the Wall Street Journal's All Things Digital indicating that the issue will be addressed. And it says here that in the future, apps that collect or transmit a user's contact data without their permission are in violation of our guidelines. And it says we're working to make this even better for our customers, as we have done with location services. Any app wishing to access contact data will require explicit user approval in a future software release. So with location services, whenever you go to an app or install a new app, it asks you, can it use your location? And similarly, any new app, once this update is released, will say, do you want them to have your address book? Look, in the end, whether it's Apple or whether it's Google, we need a better privacy policy, which allows people who want to be private and not have their data tracked and used able to opt out and specifically know if their data is being used or not. Because ultimately there's room for abuse. This is a country where on one hand people want privacy, on the other hand some people want their stuff tracked to get better services. But the middle ground is just companies should be straightforward and honest and provide a mechanism for disclosing clearly stuff to people and allowing them to opt out. Well, it looks like good things are happening in terms of Apple's suppliers. Foxconn is its biggest supplier and assembler of iPhone, iPad, and maybe other devices in China. And there's a story out, I guess the heat from things like the New York Times article are changing things. It says that iPad maker Foxconn is lifting the pay of workers in China at the Foxconn factory. This is Reuters. And it says Foxconn workers had their wages raised by 16 to 25% from this month, the third raise since 2010. So, maybe that'll give a better light to Apple's suppliers. Now, Apple also earlier in the week announced that it was appointing a labor watchdog group to go in and inspect its factories of its suppliers. And also Apple gave, I think, ABC News access to the assembly plants at Foxconn. So Apple is taking seriously this criticism that its suppliers have poor labor practices. And kudos to Apple. I think Apple's doing a much better job than other Western companies. But the real challenge is this. The challenge is what happens when your competitors start going to cheaper services? How do you stay competitive? Okay, now things are really crazy in China. One of the crazier things that's been brewing is that there's a company in China that claims to own the iPad name. And according to Boy Genius Report, the Chinese company wants to sue Apple for $2 billion over the iPad name. Now, this thing, to me, is kind of like a shakedown and a scam, and shows how the Chinese legal system might not be great for Westerners, because the whole reason this is happening is because this, maybe there's bad courts in China. So Apple, before the iPad came out, went around and secretly bought the right to the iPad name from various companies. And it bought the iPad name from a company in Hong Kong that owned the iPad name in China and Taiwan and so. And they didn't pay a lot of money. I mean, they paid like, I don't know, $50,000 or $80,000 or something like that. And the company didn't know that Apple was buying it. Apple created another company that had like a funny name. That's acronym was IPAD. And then obviously this is like a shakedown, because the subsidiary or the parent of the company or the subsidiary is claiming that it still owns the right to the iPad name, even though the parent company sold the name. And already a Hong Kong court has ruled in favor of Apple, but Hong Kong is not on the mainland. It's sort of controlled by China, but the courts are independent of the Chinese courts. I'm not sure. I'm not a legal expert on China courts, but that's the way it seems. And so this company is trying to get some sort of payday from Apple. And at one point they tried to stop the export of iPads. It's like the Wild West in China. But now the story is that the Chinese firm is threatening to sue Apple in the United States over the iPad name. Go ahead, try that. I think it's a joke. This is clearly a shakedown by some company that sold its rights and now is trying to pull a fast one against Apple. Question is, how much of a nuisance is it for Apple, and will Apple pay anything to make it go away? We'll see. One of the more interesting and provocative posts came out this week from the great website Asymco, ASYMCO.com, from Horst Dadu. He's a very smart former Nokia executive who now blogs, and he seems to concentrate on Apple and its business. And he had a blog post out on February 16th entitled, "Apple sold more iOS devices in 2011 than all the Macs it sold in 28 years. So this is pretty wild, because the Mac, I think, came out, in 1984. And so from 1984 to the present, Apple has sold as many Macs as iOS devices, which are like the iPhone, the iPad, and the iPod Touch. Now, to the Mac's credit, the iOS device's average price is a lot less than the Mac. The original Macs, they were costing like $2,000, $3,000. And even now, a Mac goes for really like $1,000 to $2,000 or $3,000 or so. So, but it's still an interesting figure, and he's got a graph which just shows, how quickly Apple got to 150 million or so. Apple sold, actually, it looks like I don't know, somewhere between 100 million and 150 million, like 125 million, 125 million max, and basically the iPhone is close to 200 million. So it's pretty impressive and just shows how successful these iOS devices are. Speaking of numbers and stats, an interesting number came out this week, and Cult of Mac reported on it in an article entitled "Smartphones and Tablets Will Outnumber Humans by the End of the Year." So this is kind of interesting. Apparently there was an analysis by Cisco, and Cisco's analysis revealed that by the end of 2012, internet-connected mobile devices will outnumber humans. And it says here by 2016 there will be an estimated 10 billion such devices. So, I mean, I think they're counting not only smartphones but all mobile devices, even like a simple cell phone with a web browser. And Apple stands to make a lot of money, I think, because Apple has a significant percentage of mobile devices that are on the internet. So it's an interesting figure. The proliferation of smartphones and tablets is pretty amazing. Finally, as MacRumors.com points out, Apple has announced a countdown prize because it's counting down to the 25 billionth App Store download. It's pretty amazing. We're getting close to having 25 billion apps downloaded in the App Store, and Apple's going to give a $10,000 gift prize to the winner. And they did that before, I think, with the 10 billionth download. And apparently the 10 billionth download was like in February 2010. So it's pretty quick. It's only taken like a year for it to get to 10 billion. It says Apple has run similar promotions in the past with a nearly identical 1 for 10 billion App Store downloads taking place just over a year ago, and another one for 10 billion iTunes Music Store downloads coming in February. So basically in a year for the App Store, it's gone from 10 billion to 25 billion. So that's pretty fast. So very cool. Congratulations, Apple, and maybe one of us will be the lucky ones to be the 25 billionth downloader. Okay, thanks for listening to the Apple Podcast. This is Lex at Mac's Future. This is episode 106. And again, this is a chit-chat-free podcast brought to you by the MacsFuture.com website. And you can help out by going to YouTube, seeing the video version of this, or Blip TV under Mac's Future, or YouTube's under Mac's Future, or going to iTunes and giving it any sort of positive review. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This has been a Mac's Future production.